Sometimes it's better.
British English. Third is an Anglicization.
Thank you.
Vikings, bubonic plague, the Sans-Culottes, selective breeding in the 17th century, and Victor Hugo.
There you go.
I'm honestly not certain that I'm going to get all of those in a logical...
Well, you get extra points for folding in none of the other ones.
Vikings, bubonic plague is probably not too far to make. As far as we can tell, bubonic plague probably originated somewhere in Asia. The interesting thing is that recent research probably indicates that the Black Death was not in fact bubonic plague. The medical characteristics don't actually fit bubonic plague or even pneumonic plague, which is the respiratory variety of the Black Plague. There is a considerable body of thought that thinks that the Black Death was in fact some kind of viral disease, probably closely related to something like Ebola. Which leaves us with the fun possibility that it's actually still lurking somewhere in the African highlands where it probably originated from and might come out and kill half of Europe again. Sometime in the future, just for fun. Something more similar to that. Than, basically, the problem with bubonic plague as a candidate for the Black Death is that it's not infectious enough. It's actually not particularly infectious, as in terms of spread. Spreading from one person to the other. It's not droplet contagious, i.e. by air contact, whereas some of the viral hemorrhagic illnesses are. And it's pretty clear that the Black Death was contagious by contact. It's also pretty clear that the Black Death almost certainly was not bubonic plague spread by rat fleas, because the black rat is basically an Asian warm weather creature that has only ever survived in the Mediterranean area of Europe. It's only common in port cities in northern Europe, and that was true in the 14th century too. And brown rats were not present in Britain or northern Europe at the period of the Black Death.
So was the plague brought by the Vikings?
Not as far as we know. The Vikings had largely stopped Viking by the time that the Black Death arrived. Although, had they been Viking, they would have been very good candidates because they travelled all over Europe, literally, in fact down to Africa. Did you know that there are more Arabic coins found in Viking graves in Scandinavia than European ones? They actually did a lot of trading with the Middle East and North Africa. Trading and raiding, but probably more trading, and with the Byzantine Empire. Some of you probably know the Byzantine emperors for about 300 years had a bodyguard made up of Vikings, the Varangian Guard. And in fact, after the Norman conquest of England, a considerable quantity of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy ended up in the Varangian Guard in exile. So for about a generation after Hastings, half the Varangian Guard was exiled. Extremely high-class Anglo-Saxons, mostly with links to the royal family, to Godwin's family.
Was Victor Hugo a descendant of the Varangian Guard?
Did Victor Hugo ever use a chamber pot?
Almost certainly.
Almost certainly.
7 steps to Hugo.
We were talking about the invention of the stirrup, or rather the transmitting of the stirrup to Europe in probably the 8th or 9th century, probably by the Mongols, who were, like the Vikings, an aggressive warrior race who spread ideas and knowledge and lethal diseases all over Europe. In fact, the only reason the Mongols didn't actually get into Central Europe was that they were hit with the plague in 1260 something, when they had were actually in the Middle East and on the borders of Poland, and their armies were hit by a plague and lost a lot of their strength. so they kind of paused, and then back in Mongolia, the great Khan died, so they all raced back to see who would be the next Khan. And that's basically the reason the Mongols didn't end up like in France or something, because they were pretty much unstoppable at the time. Partly due they were a horse-based military and cavalry, a cavalry nation. In fact, they lived on their horses. Their major food was a kind of cheese made by mixing horse's milk with horse's blood. And their major alcoholic drink was fermented horse's milk.
Did they selectively breed the horses?
They didn't, as far as I know. In fact, their horses were probably quite small, as were most horses at that period of history. By the Middle Ages, there was a degree of selective breeding, for instance, to produce the horses that the medieval knights rode. The medieval great horse, or war horse of the knights, we don't actually know what it was, because from the sources they appear to have been extremely large, but not typical draft horses in the modern sense. So we actually don't, basically the breed is lost. We don't actually know what the medieval, there was a specific breed of horse, or type of horse, that we may not have anything that's exactly like it today that was used by the knights. Selective breeding certainly occurred back then, but it wasn't really very scientific or methodological, as it were.
Until the 17th
Until
century.
the 17th century, exactly. Or really, late 17th, early 18th century was when the beginnings of scientific.
Do you know what
breeding
kind of
in
horse that
agriculture-
Napoleon rode?
No, I don't, but I know it was named Marengo.
Marengo.
And that after he died, after it was killed in battle, Napoleon had it stuffed and brought its stuffed body around with him on his future campaigns.
That's charming.
I believe, if I remember right.
He was such a softie.
Do they put rockers on it?
Wheels, maybe, I'm not sure.
That's how they got it around, with wheels and with rockers, yeah.
What's that? What else?
Selective breeding from the late 17th through the 18th century was actually a major part of the agricultural revolution of the 18th century, which is really preceded the Industrial Revolution by a generation or so, but had a radical effect on life, because basically productivity of agriculture improved significantly, which was a factor in the population growth in Europe in the later 18th and 19th century. They basically could support more people. If you look at the paintings, you might have seen some of the 18th century paintings of animals from Britain. There became selective breeding, scientific breeding actually became a craze among sort of gentlemen farmers, and people had pictures of themselves painted with these ridiculously huge pigs, for instance. Or it sort of became a contest among the gentlemen farmers of the 18th century to who could produce the biggest animals, and many of the modern breeds go back more or less to that period, or their ancestors anyway. I mean, we've selectively bred even more so since then. But, and of course, the increasing mechanization of farming, and the increasing, particularly in Britain, of course, the enclosure movement, in which common land was transferred to private ownership, and farming increasingly became big farmers employing people rather than a sort of peasant farming system, which was far more productive, but actually resulted in less sort of social equality. And then when the Industrial Revolution started, mechanization put an increasing number of people out of work, and it created for the first time in history a real urban underclass. It began to happen even in the 18th century. It happened in Britain first, but the changes in agriculture were happening to a degree across Europe, even in France, which was partly what led to the creation of that urban underclass who formed the core of the French Revolution, the sans-culottes.
There you go, sans-culottes, and he did it. Good job. Well, he did the 5 that he was supposed to.
I didn't really talk about Victor Hugo, but Victor Hugo's novels, of course, reflected the poverty of that urban underclass produced by the Industrial Revolution.
That was helped by the selective breeding.
That was nice.
He finished off.
It was probably
the song.
subconscious.
So, our first time at
The
Stump Ian.
shorthands, yeah. And